Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, or should I say good evening. Welcome to the first lecture in our course on Witnesses to South African History. I will just say a few words about our convener. Dr Elizabeth van Heyningen has taught at the University of Cape Town's Department of Historical Studies for many years. Her main research interests are the history of Cape Town, the social history of medicine, and the history of colonial women. Her book, The Concentration Camps of the Anglo-Boer War, A Social History, which was published in 2013, was described as, and I'm quoting, a work of impressive originality and admirable comprehensiveness. Her other publications include a 2-volume social history of Cape Town with Nigel Warden and Vivian Bickford-Smith. She has also written a history of the Cape medical profession in the 19th century with Harriet Deacon and Professor Howard Phillips, who is also in the audience. She was awarded the University of Cape Town's Meritorious Prize for her 2 volumes on the social history of Cape Town. She is an honorary research associate with the History Department, University of Stellenbosch, and she has also lectured previously at summer school on the history of the Boer War concentration camps. So, shall we give her a welcome?
Can everybody hear me? Great. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming along to this course. I'm afraid there's going... Oh, first of all, before I go any further, I just want to make one announcement. Gerald Groenewald, who is talking about slavery, is unable to be here tomorrow, so he's going to talk on Thursday, and Pamela Maseko, who's talking about black writing, is going to speak tomorrow. So there's a switch around of 2 lectures for your information. We asked UCT if we could present a series of lectures on the volumes published by the Riebeeck Society, because this year is our centenary. We were formally founded in August of 1918. The society, well, I was trying to think about why the society has survived so long. And I think it's because of people, but 3 groups of people. Very loyal members, some of whom joined as teenagers and remained members throughout their lives. Council members who have remained active also sometimes for decades. And certainly in the last 20 years or so, we've also had a wonderful administrative staff. In addition to that, our editors are unpaid, and we draw on their goodwill as well. Because busy academics have devoted months to the unremunerated tasks of transcribing and giving context to the manuscripts. So there's been a body of people who have been prepared to commit themselves very substantially to the society over this 100 years. And I thought, why is this? Of course, there's some easy answers. Some people just like history. For academics, there are obviously sometimes academic advantages. It's in their area of work, that kind of thing. But I think more important, for all of these people, we consider that history is both interesting and important. And we are all willing to commit to this belief. And I think this is fairly remarkable, because in our modern world, there's very little value, as far as I can see, placed on understanding the past. Lots of history, but not really about understanding the past. And you see this in documentaries, and you see this in a whole range of ways. Increasingly, history is functional. It's used to boost political parties and particular political viewpoints. I don't want to suggest there's such a thing as objective history, but I do think that a deeper understanding of the past promotes a better understanding of the present. And I'm just going to give one example of this. I was in England last year, around about October, and I found it a curiously depressed place in some ways, and this is because of Brexit. I've tried very hard to understand why so many Britons voted for Brexit, and in the end I came to the conclusion that it is, at least in part, a dream, a wish, a vision for warm, functioning communities. The dream of going back to the sort of England that this little Cotswold village indicates. And there are a whole range of films and TV series which promote this kind of sense of England as a cosy community. Downton Abbey is one of the recent ones, something like Midsummer Murders. Sometimes this is about community in hard-pressed northern mining villages, so you get things like Billy Elliot or Brast Off. Sometimes also it's about wartime togetherness, and Dunkirk, of course, is the one that leaps to mind as being promoted quite recently. Foyle's War, Atonement, and then the film about Dunkirk. But the problem with all of these things is that this is how myth begins to be created, not history. And let me just give you one example of the disjunction that is going on with these kinds of things. This building in the background is Highclere, Downton Abbey, where Downton Abbey is set. But in fact, Highclere was the home of the Carnarvon family. Now, Carnarvon is a name that is littered all over South Africa. Why? And that is because of this guy up here, the Earl of Carnarvon, twice Secretary of State for the Colonies. Carnarvon was instrumental in federating Canada, and having federated Canada, he then thought that he could create a South African federation in a very diverse land. It's not to say Canada wasn't diverse and divided, it was, but he pulled it off there. But in South Africa, many white residents saw Britain, indeed, as quite rightly, as imperial conquerors. So Carnarvon's efforts at federation then were followed by these various events that I've listed here. Theophilus Shepston's annexation of the Transvaal, Sir Bartle Frere, appointed by Carnarvon to carry forward this policy, leads troops into the Ninth Frontier War, the Natal Constitution was suspended, Sir Bartle Frere attempts to overthrow the elected Cape government, and then there you get the invasion of Zululand, and thereafter followed two resounding British defeats at Isandlwana and in 1881 at Majuba. So Carnarvon and Carnarvon's ideas about federation then had a whole lot of unanticipated consequences, which you certainly don't get any sense of when you're seeing Downton Abbey. There's no sense of Downton Abbey and the Downton Abbey family as being part of this larger British imperial world. When I try to explain to people that the European project was something entirely different, it's not about warm communities, I have found repeatedly that I've been met with blankness. I point out that the last 70 years has been a miracle for Europe. The history of Europe, as far back as we know it, has been a history of conflict, and sometimes of horribly destructive war. And I've listed some of the major events here. The 30 Years' War, which was a terrible period for Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession, the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, which was hugely destructive, a really terrible war. And then, of course, the First and Second World Wars. So war has riven Europe for a long time, and Britain has been inescapably a part of these conflicts. The European Union then grew out of a vision to bring peace to Europe, and they have succeeded, apart from the awful breakup of Yugoslavia, which is, in a sense, was not a part of this anyway. The people who voted for Brexit have forgotten this. They think the European Union is about a whole lot of other things, but at the core, it's about ending conflict in Europe. You'll be wondering why I'm going on about this and what this has to do with South Africa and witnesses to history. We in South Africa are also in the process of nation building and of reconciliation in a complex, multicultural, divided society. It isn't easy, and I think it's impossible if we don't have an understanding of the stories and the histories of communities other than our own. The VRS, the Van Riebeeck Society, was born partly out of conflict, but it was also part of this kind of project. 100 years back, in 1918, there was also a new South Africa. And men like John X. Merriman, whom I'm going to say a bit more about in a moment, were concerned about ways in which you achieve reconciliation, ways in which you build a new society, ways in which you create at least shared histories, common histories, on which you can establish ethnic identities, establish the stories of a nation, because nations need their stories, but they don't need too much myth. The way, therefore, in which they believed that they could help to bring this about was to make the past direct and interesting, even attention-gripping, and to do this through making original documents available, to hear the story, as it were, from the horse's mouth. The VRS came into being almost by accident. In November of 1911, only a year after Union, A.C.G. Lloyd, who was the librarian of the South African Library, discovered amongst the library's holdings a fragment of Adam Tass's diary for 1704. This was not the original diary. The original diary has long since disappeared. Rather, it was a copy which had been made at The Hague for the hearing of Adam Tass and his associates in Holland when they took their complaints about Willem Adriaans van der Stel to Holland. And just to remind you, and I'm sure you don't need too much reminding about Adam Tass, Adam Tass was the leader of the Free Burghers who opposed the corrupt Dutch East India Company in the figure of Willem Adriaan van der Stel, who owned Vergelegen. In other words, Tass seemed to symbolize the struggle for freedom from the yoke of colonialism. And he was an ideal icon in the creation of a new national identity. Adam Tass has long been an iconic figure in the Afrikaner historical imagination, but he was sufficiently distant for him also to be a figure with whom English-speaking South Africans could identify as well. John X. Merriman, who was one of the trustees of the library, felt particularly strongly that this piece of South African history should be more widely known. So the trustees of the library, then, led by Merriman, raised the funds to publish the volume edited by Leo Forshire. And it remains timely. That heading up at the top, I found a couple of days ago, I was Googling, actually looking for a portrait of Adam Tass, and instead I came up with this heading, and I think I don't need to say any more about it. It has immediate resonances in South Africa today. So these notions of fighting against corruption then carry right through in our history. That picture over there, that one, is taken from something called the Contradictie, which was a body of documents compiled for this case in Holland. And this, of course, this one is modern-day Vergelegen with those wonderful camphor trees. This, of course, was all before the establishment of the VRS, and Adam Tass's diary was soon out of print. But when we reached our 50 years, and we started a second series, we republished Adam Tass's diary as volume 1 of the second series. And because this was the first of a new series, the volume's a little bit unusual in having a series of forwards about its genesis. So Anna Bussiken, for instance, said that this fragments from the diary of Adam Tass, as she felt it should be called, she reminds us that it's historically dangerous to forget that the officials allowed only those parts of the diary to survive, which in their opinion placed Tass in an unfavorable light with the 17. So this is only a fragment of the diary. This is not the whole story. The diary was also translated into English, which we do routinely. And we had the happy event that in this particular case that this book was prescribed as a text at Stellenbosch University, and it became a bestseller. That doesn't often happen with our volumes, but it was very nice. So it is out of print. The title of the series, as I said, is Witness to History, and I think it would be remiss to ignore this, especially in the case of Adam Tass. Of course, Adam Tass is primarily about these political protests, about ridding corruption, about rights and freedoms and those sorts of things. But it's also a 17th century document. Adam Tuss and Willem Adriaan van der Stel are both Hollanders of that rambunctious 17th century, not of the more prim and formal 19th century. And reading the diary, the Cape comes vividly to life as a sociable society, but one which also rested clearly on the labor of slaves. And I couldn't resist using this particular quotation. Now, this is actually Willem Adriaan van der Stel. It's not in Adam Tuss's diary. I've taken it from the forward. But it's Willem Adriaan van der Stel's view of Adam Tuss. And I should explain that Adam Tuss made his fortune by marrying a rich widow, a very common practice in the Cape. And Willem Adriaan van der Stel is very supercilious about it. For him, Adam Tuss is the nouveau riche. You'd think he was an aristocrat himself, the way he goes on. So within this grassy clover meadow, this canting rogue, with the padding of the streets, and with those many years of idle living, was come by no great profit, did attain an easeful, fortunate, and right pleasant estate. But with this unfamiliar affluency, thus gotten in a twinkling, there was no keeping of oneself within the limits of discretion. And with his confraternity, he must still be spending days and nights in swilling and toping and feasting and junketing. For of their rustic husbandry would each man dress his table with dishes 10 and 12, bespread with tarts and pastries, turkeys and geese and capons and the rest, until that with these roisterings they did begin to forge presumptuous, lecherous and overweening extravagances, and reckless purposes and designs, for to disturb the governor in his repose, and with infatuate and abandoned naughtiness to trample underfoot the general peace and quiet. Well, there's a certain amount of truth in what he says, because once you get into Adam Tuss's diary, Adam Tuss is forever visiting his neighbours and having a dope and having a chat and smoking pipes. So you can dip anywhere into the diary and you get, I've just taken 3 little excerpts which give you little glimpses of life at the Cape during this period. The first is dealing with the agriculture. Misty morning, not long before the sun came through, our slaves were again busy cutting Sicilian wheat and rye, and I have no idea what Sicilian wheat is. This forenoon, the cutting of the rye and Sicilian wheat was completed, so the Hottentots are about to leave again for Mrs. Albert's. And remember, of course, the Hottentots were not enslaved, so what you've got here is itinerant workers moving from one farm to another. The second one deals with the uncertainties of health in the 17th century, but also women's conviviality. This day the abscess on my wife's breast was opened and a good deal of matter was discharged. In the afternoon, Mr. Tracey van der Bijl and Mr. Toy came here, and after they had enjoyed a drink of tea, read some verses, had something to eat, and took their leave. And then much more frequently, as you go through the diary, this kind of thing. Went to visit Mr. van der Bijl, encountered neighbours, Mrs. van der Heyden and Pretorius, and we fell into brisk discourse over a glass of wine and a pipe of tobacco, and left home for the evening. And one would guess that the discourse had a lot to do with the said corruption of Willem Adriaan van der Stel. So it's well worth reading. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that volumes like this give you not only a fairly accurate notion of the larger issues, but it brings to one also the intimacy of life at that time. I just want to return now to the origins of the VRFS very briefly. After the Tuss Diary was published and it sold well, there was some money left. So then the trustees of the library decided to publish Baron von Pallant's General Remarks on the Cape of Good Hope. Now, this is a rather rare work. It had been actually suppressed by De Mist in 1803. So they published that in 1917. And again, they had another bestseller on their hands because General Herzog objected strongly to it. General Herzog was much upset that the work referred to the bad treatment of the Khoi, the Hottentots, by the Boers. So he denounced the work in rousing terms and, as I say, turned it into an instant bestseller. So here was the library then with quite a lot of money, but the function of the library was not publication. And with this money available, the trustees of the library decided rather to set up an independent society to publish works of this kind. Clearly there was a market for it. But it went further than that. John X. Merriman, who was one of the trustees in particular, felt very strongly that history has got more than just a general interest, that you can learn from history, that your understanding of how your own world works gains from looking at what has happened in the past. For us now, our name has become something of a burden, because for many people it symbolizes colonial invasion and suppression. At the time, however, the name of the society was a compromise. Other names that were suggested was the Kruger Society and the Rhodes Society. And you can see rapidly that that is not very reconciliatory in 1918. The other problem with our name now is that it has become increasingly misleading. People tend to think, as I mentioned, that our volumes continue to represent white colonial hegemony. They think that we are a Cape society and we don't have any interest in the rest of South Africa, although in fact we publish works on Southern Africa, not just on South Africa. And they think also that our volumes represent a history which has no relevance to the present. So when we reach our 100th volume, which may be this year, we plan to change our name to Historical Publications Southern Africa, Historische Publicaties Zuider-Afrika, HIPSA for short, and to remove the personality from it. This is the actual first volume that was published, the reports of Chevron. Essentially, these are economic reports, plans of the colonists in part, for the economic development of the colony. And they're rather kind of pie-in-the-sky type of ideas. Coal mining at the Cape, silk production, growing of tobacco, indigo, and coffee, all of which, of course, as we know, are not very successful here in the Western Cape. De Chevron didn't think much of this, and he also was concerned about the use of slave labor. So he shot down all their suggestions very briskly and urged the colonists to accustom themselves to European labor rather than importing more slaves. Now, I'm not going to quote from this volume itself, but to look a little bit at John X. Merriman's foreword to this volume, because John X. Merriman, as I said, was very conscious of the dialogue between past and present. And he wrote, "The whole of the documents contained in this volume are deserving of study by all those who are interested in present-day problems." So from its inception then, some of the foundations for the selection of our volumes was put in place. One was the principle of multilingual texts, and in addition to that, secondly, from the first volume, subjects have included issues of social justice and life in a multicultural Cape. By no means all our witnesses have been only white. Volume 9, for instance, was Die Dagboek van Hendrik Witbooi, Kaptein van die Witbooi Hottentotte, which was not only the testimony of a black man, but also a part of Namibian history. So we moved into the history of Namibia, Southwest Africa, as it was then, very early on. I'm now going to jump right forward to last year's volume. I've referred to Merriman several times. He was a prolific letter writer, and we have in fact published 4 volumes of his correspondence. But coincidentally, last year, he came back into the picture because the 2017 volume was the post-war letters of President M.T. Steyn of the Free State. This should actually have come out in 2016, but we have our glitches sometimes, because Steyn died in 1916. Somewhat inadvertently, I became one of the editors of this volume. And when I started, I was troubled about being involved in letters which seemed to be harking back to a segregationist South Africa. But in fact, the Steyn letters raise very relevant questions about language in a multicultural society and about the making of a new nation. In 1910, the 4 British colonies entered union. The first Prime Minister, Louis Botha, had been primarily concerned above all to reconcile Afrikaners divided by the war. And we tend to forget now that there were a substantial number of Afrikaners who opposed that war. Steyn, on the other hand, and J.B.M. Hertzog, General formerly Judge Hertzog, were deeply committed to the restoration of a people severely damaged by this destructive war. Others, like Jan Smuts, who was much less of an ethnic Afrikaner than Steyn, and John X. Merriman, the last Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, were more concerned to overcome the Afrikaner-English divide. And union was made very largely, particularly by these 3 remarkable men. This triumvirate, as the historian Phyllis Lewson calls them, of Jan Smuts, Merriman and Steyn. Theirs was a relationship by letter. Steyn was an invalid, unable to participate actively in political life. But his enormous prestige amongst Afrikaners as a result of his role in the war made his support for union critical, and Smuts and Merriman realized this. So these 3 then were constantly exchanging letters, making plans, talking about the form that the new union, the new amalgamation should take, about franchise, about language, about a whole lot of issues. They are also readers. So they buy books and they send them to one another and they talk about the books that they are exchanging. And they're drawing ideas from these books as well. So one gets a very clear idea from these letters about the behind-the-scenes making of union. And it's very enlightening. And not always admirable, I have to say. So one of the things they talk about is, should it be a confederation or union? And with the examples of the American Civil War and the recent Australian Federation, they opted for union, which they felt would be less divisive. Another major question, of course, was the franchise. The women's vote is never discussed in these letters. And Steyn is probably the only one of the 3 who might have supported a female franchise, interestingly. But black people had the vote at the Cape. They could not be ignored. So that was a much more difficult problem. And the historians of these people, Phyllis Lewson, who wrote the biography of Merriman, people like Keith Hancock, who wrote the major biography of Smuts, and Leonard Thompson, who wrote the book on the making of union, all of them liberals, agonize quite a lot, discuss in quite a lot of detail the way in which these 3 men are handling this question of the black franchise. Because it is a very tricky one, especially for modern-day liberals to get their heads around. Merriman, the Cape man, the archetypal liberal, wished that the whole problem would go away. I wish we had no black man in South Africa, he wrote to Smuts. On the other hand, he also opposed Smuts' proposal for white manhood suffrage. He considered that the poor whites were demoralized by poverty. In many cases, he said, they had sunk below the level of the clean living native. So they go on then, the 3 of them, to exchange their ideas about the black franchise. And essentially what they are doing is talking about social justice on the one hand, but not wanting to confront it on the other hand. And you get Merriman writing to Smuts, for instance, God forbid I should advocate a general enfranchisement of the native barbarian. And that's a significant word for Merriman. He's making a distinction between barbarian and civilized, not between black and white. All I think is required for our safety, is that we shall not deny him the franchise on the account of colour. We can then snap our fingers at Exeter Hall, the missionaries, and Downing Street, and experience teaches me that there is no surer bulwark for all legitimate rights of any class or colour than representation in Parliament. And a couple of weeks later, he goes on, in the native case, we are fettered by the notion, which all of us entertain, that the native is a skepsel. But he's a human being, though an undeveloped one. And my contention is that the only safe way of management is to give him a chance to acquire political rights if he shows himself fit to manage them. Steyn does not come from this kind of liberal perspective. Talking to his own people, in speeches to his own people at this time, he talks about the colored gevaar being a world gevaar, for instance. He sees black people as much more threatening. But in writing to Smuts and to Merriman, he plays this down. So he says, for instance, he doesn't believe black people should get the franchise at all, however civilized. But on the other hand, he doesn't want them to get the franchise from the British. If the natives have the franchise, they must get it from our parliament, so that they're not brought under the delusion that only the Englishman is their friend, and whenever there is an election, go with the party who claims the flag as belonging solely to them. So what do? In the end, they just brush the whole thing under the carpet, and they were aided in this by the British, who also brushed it under the carpet. All agreed that they could manage this problem sometime in the future. Sometime in the future, the whole thing would just sort itself out. So, as we know, the Act of Union for the majority of black people in South Africa was a sellout, basically. By no means all the witnesses that we have published are the great men who were considered in the past to form proper history. And I thought I would introduce you here to somebody very different, to Jeremiah Goldswain. Jeremiah Goldswain was an 1820 settler. He was born in Buckinghamshire. He was a sawyer by trade, and at 17, driven by unemployment, he became an indentured labourer to William Waite and immigrated to South Africa. He married when he got here, and the couple had 9 surviving children. Goldswain's an interesting man. He's uneducated, but he's not illiterate. And he writes this very lengthy chronicle, published in 2 volumes, which is written phonetically in the Buckinghamshire accent. And it's an intimate and detailed account of the travails of the ordinary settler. Much of the Goldswain volumes are concerned with the Eastern Frontier conflicts, and I'm not going to talk about that. What I find so enjoyable about Jeremiah Goldswain is the way in which he gives you a sense, again, of daily life on the frontier, of the struggles of the early settlers, of the problems of health, for instance. You'll have to excuse me, I'm partly a medical historian, so I tend to talk about health. But I thought I would use, out of 2 volumes, what do you excerpt to talk about? And I thought here I would make this point, since we are thinking a lot about immigration throughout the world now. And the point that I wanted to make for these 1820 settlers and for all those people who were immigrating in the 19th century is that it was not a happy thing to do. It was indeed very painful. Remember, of course, that those people who immigrated to South Africa would almost certainly never see their families again, especially if they were poor. And an exchange of letters might be, you might get an exchange of letters over 6 months, sometimes only once in a year. So you really are separated from your family when you go. And so when he's still at home, he meets his mother, tells her he's going to the Cape. And I'm not going to try and repeat the Buckinghamshire dialect. I met her in company with a young female. They were both weeping. I asked them what were the matter. When my mother could speak, she says, I was a very undutiful child, and I being her only child, she said, "Ah, Jerry, you will break my heart if you are determined to go and leave me forever. For if you go, I shall never see you again." At this time, I felt that my heart was hard and seemed to care for nothing. When we got home, there were many of my relations and neighbours who were come to know if it were true that I were going to the Cape of Good Hope. And when I answered them, one and all began to weep and declare that the first thing that they should hear would be that I was killed by the wild beast and that I was a very undutiful son. So it was hard to immigrate. And then, as I say, there are wonderful pieces in that chronicle. But I kept this one out. This is, as I said, they had 9 surviving children. This was their 10th child, and he died. About this time, Mrs. Goldswain was confined with her 10th child. It was a son, but born a cripple in both arms and legs. The doctor informed us that he could do nothing for the child. We tried by friction and sweat oil and was in hope that we should get them right. The child was very patient, never cried. We kept on until the 19th day, when my poor wife called me to her and told me her fears that she thought the child's little body was not right and that the child was not so well as she would wish, and what to do we did not know, as there was no doctor nearer than Grahamstown, 28 miles. We concluded that if the child did not get better by the morn, we would send for the doctor. But to our great grief, we saw about 9 o'clock at night, we saw the child was taken for death. We searched his little body and found that inflammation had taken place in the bowels. In 2 hours, the child died. Now, this is a 10th child. You might think that parents are a little hardened to the loss of one of these children, but no, not at all. And you can see Jeremiah's affection for this child coming through too. The mother took it so much to heart that I saw something was not done to raise her spirits, that it would not be long before she followed the child. And he realizes that part of Elizabeth's concern is the child hasn't been christened. And she is satisfied when he promises to erect a tombstone to the baby, and he inscribes the verses below on it. Happy child, thy time is ended, 19 days were thy due. Go by angel guards attended to the sight of Jesus, go. I'm going to turn now to a very different kind of text which we've published and much later on. As I mentioned, from the beginning we published bilingual texts, but in South Africa today we have 11 official languages. How do we handle that one? And we have tried, at least in part, to embrace it. In 2006 we published our first volume in an African language, in Tswana, and this is this volume, Words of Botswana, which consists of letters written by Christian converts to the London Missionary Society in Kurumon. The London Missionary Society started to publish this journal in Tswana called Mahoko Abekwana. No idea if my pronunciation is okay. It's a fascinating volume. For language experts, it's particularly interesting for the language which appears, because it's an early Tswana, it's Tswana just at the point of being frozen by being written down. But for me, what I found so fascinating about the volume was the way in which these correspondents are so intrigued by their own language, by their relationships amongst one another, and also by their enthusiasm for their world and for learning. There's a wonderful kind of enthusiasm through many of these letters. And the 2 excerpts are a little bit long, I'm afraid, this one particularly, but I thought I would put it in because it does give you an idea of the way in which they're talking about language in the first place. I hear that and also about their sense of where they are in the world. These are people with a very clear sense of their right to the knowledge of the world, and they don't want to be wholly dependent on Europeans for their information. I hear that you plan to publish a small newspaper for Botswana in their language. How happy we will be if you do that. To tell the truth, we are tired of rumours, because sometimes when we expect news, we hear a rumour. How true that is now. Which then needs to be verified by the newspapers of the Europeans. We are also tired of continually asking Europeans about the news of other nations. So, editor, it would really help us if you could publish for us the news headlines of the world every month, so that we might share in hearing about other people, instead of being left ignorant of other newspapers as if we are people who do not deserve to be informed about foreign events. Thank you, teacher. However, you should not be afraid to tell us news even if it is not nice. So please, teacher, in whose language will the newspaper of the Botswana be printed? Realize that although Europeans group us together as the Tswana, we are ourselves a variety of different nations and languages. There are the Batlaping, the Baralong, the Bakwena, and the Bangwato. And I have not mentioned the many nations of the northeast. So I ask you, teacher, in whose language will the newspaper of the Botswana be printed? We have many variations of our language. If I am a Motlaping, I will laugh at some Bakwena and Bangwato as if they have a speech impediment and do not know how to talk when they say nta ke ta ta, which means, of course, I will come, instead of ntla ke tla tla. And the footnote, as I've said, explains that this is this use of the L or not within the phrase. And they continue this way through the volume, talking about the use of this word or the use of that word, or how we use a particular custom and how in another group they use the custom somewhat differently. But they're also coming against this clash between their recently acquired biblical knowledge and modern science. And so this guy writes, I'm asking that I be taught about the rotation of the earth and the position of the sun. And I'm not asking the editor alone. I'm asking the readers of the newspaper and everyone. I say, does the intelligence of Europeans today contradict the words of God that are in his book? I have looked for the word that agrees with the knowledge of the Europeans, and I don't see it. This verse describes how it was made. We read about the earth in Genesis 1:10. This verse describes how it was made, the earth. Verses 11 and 12 describe the work that the earth has been given to do. Regarding the sun and the moon, we read Genesis 1:14 to 18. These too are given a job. Namely, I say, it is they that were assigned to control the seasons and times. But now the knowledge of Europeans opposes the Maker regarding the way he reportedly made them. Don't read anywhere where the sun is stationary and not the earth. When we read Joshua 10:12 and 13, it is said the sun stood still and the moon, because it is they that move. Is it not like that? That is my question. And it has not ended, it still continues. So again, this is just a snippet of a very rich volume. But I think it's particularly valuable because it gives us an insight into the way in which these Christian converts were coming to terms with the modern world that was being imposed upon them to some extent, but to which they are also partly embracing. I could talk about a whole lot of others of these volumes. Pamela Maseko is going to talk tomorrow, and I think she'll probably have a slightly different approach a substantially different approach from mine. I could talk about the Dagboek of Hendrik Witbooi. I could talk about the Greek records which Karel Skuman edited rather. Or I could talk about our 2016 volume, which was called From Cattle Herding to Editor's Chair, and it's the unfinished autobiography and writings of Richard Victor Salopi Tema. And I'd love to, but I'm going to confine myself only to this one, to the autobiography and selected works of A.B. Xuma, who was president of the ANC at one stage. Because I find him an absolutely fascinating man and a man of enormous charm. And we at the VRSA are proud that I think his limited rehabilitation by the ANC is largely a result of the publication of this book. I'm constantly fascinated by his persistence, his intelligence, and his sweetness of temper. Xuma was a Xhosa. He was a medical doctor who trained in the United States, in Hungary, and in Scotland. He became president of the ANC, and because he was administratively very skillful, it was he who was largely responsible for putting the organization on its feet. He was ousted eventually by the Young Turks of Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela because they considered him too conciliatory to whites. Of course, he's acceptable to white people, but I think he also offers a role model to black people as well. Xuma was the product of a mission education, and that is critically important, I think, especially in his early career, because it gave him a network to enter into when he's studying in America, particularly a network of Wesleyans, Methodists. He taught for a little while after he got his first schooling, and then he decided he wanted to go to be a doctor. Now, at this stage, there was no medical school in South Africa, but he did not follow in the footsteps of whites, who went very largely to Scotland. Instead, he discovered that he could go and study in the United States. So off he goes to the United States with two friends. And they go first to Tuskegee Institution, which was a black institution run by Booker T. Washington. When he got there, he didn't have any money because he'd actually lent quite a lot of money to one of the other friends trying to get into the United States. So he had to study part-time. He worked on the farm. It was an agricultural institution during the day, and he attends school at night. And then after he finishes Tuskegee, he gets a job in a steel factory to earn some money. And I put this little bit in because it's an indication of this kind of lovely throwaway, deprecatory manner he has often about himself. When we presented ourselves, my companion was employed. As for me, and here you can hear the doctor speaking, who failed to show proper response to the effect of good diet during the growing period, there must have been fear in the minds of the management that they might involve themselves with the Children's Act if they employed me. I was a little dwarf, but to use the language of the stockman, I had a full mouth. So he gets the money, and he goes off to the University of Minnesota and enters the Department of Agriculture, where he partly works and partly studied, to get his basic grounding in science to go on to medical school. And this period in Minnesota seems to have been particularly critical. He finds friends there. He says, but stranger though I was, I found much sympathy and understanding from the dean of the college, the staff, and fellow students. Everyone seemed to be determined to assist in some way. But he's particularly, speaks particularly warmly of the role of Dr. Riley, Professor Riley, who was the head of the Department of Entomology and Economic Zoology. And he says about Riley, Dr. Riley was a quite unassuming, kind gentleman with a compelling personality and a profound understanding of human nature. From him and his attitude towards life, I learned much that has been of benefit to me in human relations. That close contact with him meant much then until today. Everyone can realize from this limited sketch that the University of Minnesota gave me an opportunity not only for getting an education, but also for becoming a real man. So it's clearly an enormously informative period for him. I'm not going to talk any further about him, but he goes on, as I say, he qualifies as a doctor. When he comes back to South Africa, his white associates encourage him to go and work amongst his own people in the rural areas, and he says not a bit of it. And he sets up his practice in Sophiatown. His house in Sophiatown is now the Trevor Huddleston Museum. And that is crucially important because it's working in Sophiatown and seeing what is happening in Johannesburg in this period of the 1920s and 1930s that he begins to realize that this nexus of poverty, ill health, and deprivation, which is imposed by segregation, by apartheid, is so damaging for his people. And so he starts to move into politics, moves into the ANC. But he comes through this as a medical doctor, and many of his writings are indeed about the training of black doctors, about improvement of health in the black townships, and that sort of thing. We've published a number then of black texts. We've done rather less well on women. We have, in fact, published 3 women. The first of these, not the first in time, but the first I'm going to mention, is Lady Anne Barnard. Lady Anne Barnard wrote journals which she revised and were widely distributed, and these are more careful, and those are the better-known writings. We published 1 volume of the journals. But she also had these unrevised diaries, and this quotation is from one of her unrevised diaries, which is much more informal and much more fun in many ways. And again, out of 3 volumes, how do you choose a snippet? So I picked this one. She's writing from Paradise, which is that ruin in Newlands Forest, which they used as a sort of hunting lodge. And she says, I woke unwell, had no sleep with a dreadful quantity of fleas. And they often talk about fleas at the Cape, which is incidental to the climate in the country, but which about here in a distinguished degree owing to the floors of clay above stairs. Sand and dust breed them here more than any other sort of nastiness. Within the last month, I was often obligated to undress 2 or 3 times in the course of a day. And when I have not time to devote half an hour to les plaisirs de la chasse, I changed my linen. On these occasions, 50 or 60 are not wonderful to be picked up or picked off. In the course of the day, I generally catch about 150. So for all that finery, she's very uncomfortable. And she's not the only one who talks about fleas at the Cape during this period. A second woman whom we have published is Olive Schreiner. Now, Olive Schreiner was a prolific letter writer. Many of the letters were destroyed by her husband, but a great many have survived. So our brief to Liz Stanley, who was the main editor of this volume, was to edit Olive Schreiner's South African political letters, although she does go beyond that as well. I first encountered Olive Schreiner when I was working on the papers of her brother, Will, and quite a lot of this correspondence is to her brother, and she shows a remarkable political sense very often. But what I thought I would take out here is what you can see through these letters is her gradual disillusionment about roads. And what is interesting about this is not she's concerned about things like the Glen Grey Act, but what is so wonderful about Olive Schreiner is she always cuts through the cant, she cuts through the fluff, and she gets to the heart of the matter. And you can see her doing this when she writes about roads. You have to understand that for Victorians loved heroes. And so when Rhodes arrives and he's this big man, everybody talks about him. He is going to be this man who is going to save South Africa. South Africans are a little bit keen on saviours. So she writes, this is just after she comes back from England, and she writes to her friend Erilda Cawood, Cecil Rhodes must be a splendid man, the one man of genius we have in the colony. A couple of years later, she's writing to her brother. Now, by this time, she has met Rhodes. And she says to Will Schreiner, I should like to see you working with Rhodes, but only if you could stand perfectly erect. So she jolly well knows already that Rhodes is a bit iffy. So we shall not see it, I fear, she says. And she gets herself a bit knotted up over this. He is great and sincere himself. There is not a spot of hypocrisy in Rhodes. He never calls his diplomacy principle. In a sense, Rhodes is the sincerest human creature I know. He sees things directly without any evil. There is no man in the world to whom I could show myself as nakedly, and who can at times show himself as nakedly to you. So she's still got this kind of lingering feeling that this is a man who's going to do great things in South Africa. But by 1895, she is disillusioned. And it's this disillusion which I think is so fascinating. Remember, this is before the Jameson raid. Will Schreiner is now in the second Rhodes ministry. He was, in fact, already working with Rhodes. And she writes to Will, I sometimes fear Rhodes is coming near the end of his course, and how right she was. And it need not have been. He might have all that was best and greatest in South Africa to his side. We that would have loved him so honoured him and followed him. But he has chosen not only to choose the worst men as his instruments, but to act on men always through the lowest sides of their nature, to lead them through a narrow self-interest instead of animating them with large enthusiasms. And he might have done it. Ford says he couldn't, that I'm mistaking his nature. Maybe. If so, I am yet more mistaken in his nature than I thought. For the present I feel to him not as a man who had only one path open to him, but as to a man who had, and who had looked steadily and carefully at both, and chosen the lower. He is to me an almighty might have been. And this is what I mean about getting through to the core of the problem. And she does this over and over again. I love Olive Schreiner's letters. I think they're absolutely enchanting. The third woman, the first volume on women's papers that we published, but the third one I'm mentioning here, are the papers of Dr. Jane Waterston. And I have talked about her before because I was one of the editors of this volume. Dr. Jane Waterston was a teacher, a missionary, and she became South Africa's first registered woman doctor. she was the founder of the Girls' Institution at Lovedale, and she was also one of the first group of women to qualify as a doctor in England, and she became Nyasaland, Malawi's first woman doctor as well. Later on, she moved to Cape Town, where she became an institution. When I first edited these letters, which was in the early 1980s, I used to have people coming along to me and saying, "Oh, I was a Waterston baby." And there were a lot of people who said this. Although they were contemporaries, intellectually Jane Waterston was Olive Schreiner's polar opposite. She spurned a lot of modern thought. She despised notions of evolution. "I'm sick of Tyndale and Darwin, the ape-faced man," she wrote in 1874 during the course of her medical training. All these letters are letters to Dr. James Stewart, the principal of Lovedale, with whom she was very close. And yet, although she's so hugely different from Olive Schreiner, there are two ways in which they do share matters in common. One is their shared belief in the importance of women's education and the desirability of women having careers. Jane Waterston's no suffragette, but she does care about this. And the other thing which drives her all her life is her concern for black women in Africa. And black people in Africa, but especially women, and she comes back to this over and over again. This little excerpt here is when she writes to James Stewart to explain why she's going to leave Lovedale. What she does is that she then goes to England and qualifies as a doctor, and then goes out to Nyasaland. And underlying this whole story is the story of David Livingstone. I don't have time to go into this here, but as I say, these Victorians loved heroes, and for Jane Waterston, there are two iconic heroes. One is David Livingstone, who represents, as it were, the more liberal era of her life. And the second I'll introduce you to in a moment. So here she's explaining to Stewart that she's not leaving for personal advantage, for I know the position will not be what I occupy here, and above all, she'll lose her friends. And if you and Mrs. Stewart were going into the interior, she means Central Africa, and I could not get with you as teacher, I would most willingly go as servant. With all soberness I say this. So strongly do I see the need of some light for that terrible darkness. And here she's referring to the position of women in Central Africa. And she knows that as a woman, she can bring special things to them. A man cannot do my work any more than I can do his. Her second hero is Gordon of Khartoum. And what is interesting through these Waterston letters is that you can see a shift which is going on in British history between the 1880s and 1900 or so. And the shift from a broader, more generous imperialism to jingoism. And I regret to say that you see this very much in Jane Waterston herself. And Gordon of Khartoum represents this kind of heightened urgency of later imperialism. This is the man, of course, who goes out to Khartoum, and then the British government doesn't send troops in time, and he's murdered by the Mahdi. And this is an illustration of him after he's been murdered. But she's fascinated. She follows this whole story, and she regales it to James Stewart breathlessly as it goes along. And so she writes to him, "By the time this reaches you, you will have read the cablegram of this morning announcing that the government have informed General Gordon they can send him no help for 4 months." And of course it was Kitchener who took the help to him, another South African figure. "I would like to have been there when Gordon read the telegram. I think his first thought must have been, place not your trust in rulers," the particular ruler being Gladstone. "The Cape Times is flung into my yard every morning at 6 o'clock, and I go for it as contemporary history is too exciting a present to wait until breakfast time." And I'm just going to conclude by saying a little bit about this this period of her life. Coincidentally, the following year, we published the papers of this man, Edmund Garrett, who came out to South Africa as editor of the Cape Times. He was a cousin of Agnes and Rhoda Garrett, who opened Britain's first women's interior design studio. He was a cousin also of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Britain's first woman doctor who had taught Jane.